Again, I want to thank you for joining us on today's presentation, CalPERS and COVID-19, Preparedness and Resiliency for our Employer Partners. It is now my pleasure to turn today's presentation over to your host, Brad Pacheco, Deputy Executive Officer, Communications and Stakeholder Relations with CalPERS. Brad, you have the floor.
Thank you, Phil, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for this event today. Again, Phil said my name is Brad Pacheco with CalPERS, and I'll be serving as the moderator for our discussion. In a minute, I'm going to turn the call over to CalPERS Chief Executive Officer, Marcy Frost, but before I do, I did want to share some logistics for our time together. We have a prepared presentation that should take about 30 minutes, and then as Phil has mentioned, we reserve the remainder of our time to answer any of your questions. Some of you have provided us questions in advance, and our goal is to address those along the way. And as Phil has also mentioned, if you have questions during the course of the presentation, please type them into the chat feature. We do have over 2,000 people registered today for this event, so please bear with us. We'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. We've gathered several CalPERS leaders for this event, and in addition to Ms. Frost, you will be hearing from Dan Bienvenu, our newly appointed Deputy Chief Investment Officer for the fund. Dan will provide an update on our investment portfolio, as well as talk to you about the impact COVID-19 has had on the financial markets. Scott Turando, our Chief Actuary, will be present. Scott will remind us about the overall schedule of employer contribution rates for employers and address how the volatility in the markets could impact employer contributions in the future through various scenarios. We also have joining us today Michael Cohen, our Chief Financial Officer. He will share some of the tools we have available to employers to forecast contributions, including options for employers that may have a financial necessity. And then finally, Renee Ostrander, she leads our Employer Account Management Division. She will recap some of the changes under Governor Newsom's executive orders and other personnel and reporting rules that you may want to consider. So with that, I'd like to turn the call over to our CEO, Marcy Frost.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Brad. Just another note for this session this morning. We have also invited 3 of the members of the Board of Administration to participate in the call, and what that participation will look like is at the end of the Q&A, at the end of the prepared presentation, we will have Henry Jones, Teresa Taylor, and Lisa Middleton be able to provide some closing comments, but we felt it was really important for them to be a part of this. Felt it was important for them to be able to hear the questions that are coming in from all of you and then be able to make some final comments to the group. For CalPERS, our priorities really have been first and foremost around communication. We know when these chaotic events occur that communication becomes even more imperative, more important, that we're getting facts and information out to everyone, including, starting with our own team members, our own employees, making sure that our stakeholders are informed, making sure that our members are informed. And this webinar really is to help keep our employer community informed. And, the fact that we have over 2,000 people dialing in or calling into this webinar, I think shows the thirst for information, if you will, at this point in time during some very strange events. So the other thing that has been obviously a top priority for us is continuing to make the payments out to our retirees. That's $24 billion being spent in the communities. We understand that that's the primary mission of this organization, is to make the fund sustainable, but for the purpose of continuing those payment benefits out to the majority of those living here still in California after retirement. We also know that serving members who are approaching retirement, we are seeing increases in the number of estimate requests. Our contact center is coming back to almost 3/4 of normal capacity this week. We were operating at about 50% capacity our wait times and our service level agreements remain more or less in alignment with what we had prior to the pandemic. But obviously, some of our resources may be more limited during the 8 to 5 schedule, but I'm really pleased to report that most productivity numbers are in the 90th percentile for performance. And I'm really proud of the team. They certainly understand that the mission of this organization is to both serve the members and be available to our very important partners, all of the public employers. Managing investments, we do have Dan Bienvenu, who will be able to talk about the portfolio. We know that there have been several decisions, and I've got a slide later on this, but several decisions that have really made the portfolio and the fund be in a much stronger position coming into this market downturn than, say, what had happened in 2008 and 2009. And we'll go through some of those actions, which all of you are certainly aware of because it required additional contributions coming in from the employer community. And then we want our members and our employees to be safe. So every action that we've taken, every decision that we've made to this point is to ensure the safety of our employees and ensure the safety of our members. We were pretty quick to shut down our regional locations for members being able to come in, public being able to come into either the Sacramento regional office or any of our other locations around the state. That was very important. However, the employees in those regional locations continue to take phone conference appointments from our members, and so business is continuing remotely. We have 80 to 85% of our workforce successfully working in a telework or a remote capacity. The 3 key priorities, I know I've been out to several events with the employer community, and I appreciate all of the invitations that had come in over the last couple of years so that we can get these priorities and really what we see as risks to CalPERS as a system. And the first one, it really is around investment risk and the risk appetite or the risk of the portfolio. And I will have Dan talk a little bit more about that. But, you know, the risks that we're taking to accomplish a 7% return target, or as we have started to say, to get the most out of the markets as we possibly can get to achieve that 7% return target. That does require us to take quite a significant level of risk to do that. It requires us to be diversified. It requires us to have access to private assets. And like I said, Dan will share some of our recent opportunities in those categories. And then we did start very clearly indicating over the course of the last 18 months to 2 years that one of the risks to the system is the employer's ability to pay the contribution rates, and that a member's benefit is really only as safe as their employer's ability to fund them and pay for them. So we certainly know that these times are quite strained, and this is one of the reasons that we wanted to get this webinar organized as quickly as we've done, to be able to address any questions that you have, to talk about some of the flexibilities that we could have in working with you, but really to get in front of you and be as transparent as we possibly can be during these really strange times. So as I indicated, the fund and CalPERS generally is better prepared coming into this market downturn due to the pandemic than what we were in 2008. Some of the reasons for that, and you've heard me speak about this before, is we're in a much better liquidity position. Liquidity position was really assisted by several decisions around reducing the discount rate from the 7.5 down to 7, reducing the amortization period on the unfunded actuarial liability from 30 years to 20 years, and then also getting additional payments from the state, so paying down the state's unfunded liability. That actually made the fund positive cash flow for a series of months. But the fund is back in negative cash flow to the tune of about $5 billion of that $24 billion going out in pension payments. We're also highly diversified, and the portfolio continues to be okay on the liquidity side. And we're paying attention to all of the asset allocation policy targets. We're making sure that we're keeping the board informed about our ability to stay within those policy targets. And then one of the things that Ben has done since his arrival and working with his own internal team, his executive team, if you will, is really moving the culture and the way that the organization thinks about the portfolio and moving it into this total fund perspective, which essentially means that In the past, there was much more delegated authority out to the various asset classes like private equity or global equity or real estate, and independent decisions were being made around those portfolios. And what Ben and his team have really done is to say, we need to have a total fund perspective, and the total fund is this governance top-down structure, if you will, that's investment decisions. We have to make sure that one investment decision that's happening in one side of the office isn't canceling out an investment decision that's happening on the other side of the office. So Ben has been instrumental in getting that set up, and that has really helped as we think about the duration of this pandemic and how long our entire investment office will be working remotely. But the decision-making processes are very clear to everyone. The decision-making processes are contained to the point that we know that we have control over those decisions, and we can take full advantage of certain market conditions where we were not able to take advantage of those market conditions in the past. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to go through some of the financial picture and really what the investment office has been doing and thinking about. Dan?
All right, thank you, Marcy. So as Marcy mentioned, I guess we'll start with slide 7, which is the current financial picture, and note that this is through the end of the fiscal third quarter, or March 31st. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that the current assets are around $355 billion, reflecting about a 4% fiscal year-to-date, negative 4% fiscal year-to-date return. We obviously have seen a sharp correction in the markets brought on by the COVID-19 virus. Fortunately, we had positive returns of nearly 6% for the first half of the fiscal year, so that takes us to negative 4% current fiscal year-to-date. Note that the private asset classes are still showing their December 31st value, so those yet need to come in, and there will probably be some write-down there. But then there also, the markets have been more buoyant recently, and certainly we still have 3 months left in the year. So that's the left-hand side of the chart. On the right-hand side, you can see our current strategic asset allocation, and this is what Marcy spoke to around some of the changes that we've made on making the allocation both more diversified and then also more defensive. And we'll talk later about how some of that is working. And the idea with making the portfolio both more diversified and more defensive was to certainly not eliminate but mitigate some of the impact of the drawdown. One thing we know about markets is that drawdowns happen, especially in the equity markets, and so we need to be prepared for that. And in a couple of pages, we'll talk about how that diversification is working. As we move to slide 9, it's just worth mentioning that, as Marcy mentioned, we've been preparing for a drawdown for quite a while now, not only in the more defensive strategic asset allocation, but also in some of the work that Ben has led the team on with managing our liquidity much more closely that Marcy talked about, and then also just having a plan. Some of you may recall that in June of last year, June of 2019, we had a presentation to the investment committee led by Ben that talked about how to preparing for a drawdown and how to handle a drawdown. Note that none of us had any idea that a pandemic would cause the next drawdown, but we did know that a drawdown would come. That's inevitable in the markets. We also talked about some of the stretched valuations in the portfolio. Valuations were very high going into this market drawdown. We also talked about the fact that subsequent returns, when you have stretched valuations, tend to be depressed. And then finally, that when you have a drawdown starting from a point of stretched valuations, those drawdowns tend to be more severe or more acute. We also, though, talked about some of the mistakes investors can make and how to mitigate those mistakes. The two main ones that investors make with drawdowns is, first of all, having insufficient liquidity to navigate through that drawdown, to see across the market returns being negative to get to a place where you're back to a positive place and you don't have to sell assets at depressed values. So insufficient liquidity is one of the mistakes investors make. One of the other is allowing emotion and panic to enter into the investment decision-making process. That's certainly something we want to be very careful about, and we have been very careful about. And the key there really is to have a plan and then to stick with that plan. And that's something that we've continued to do through this. We've seen real strong discipline both with our board and with the management team to have and stick with our plan as we go through these markets. So as we move on to slide 9, what you can see here is the market reaction in the portfolio, or in the markets in general and in the portfolio, and then also the importance of diversification. On the left, we talk about the market segments, and that shows the various different market segments of the public markets. And they're sorted from the highest risk, which is the cap-weighted global equity portfolio, down to the lowest risk, which is the liquidity portion of the portfolio. On the right-hand side of the slide, what you can see is the returns of those various assets over various different time points. And one thing to note really is just the magnitude of the numbers, both positive and minus. Both positive and negative. This really reflects the volatility that you've seen in the portfolio. Note that from the high, public equities were down almost a quarter of their value, almost 25%. What you also see here on the slide, though, again, is that value of diversification, which is part of the plan going into this drawdown. While public equities were down over 24%, long treasuries were actually up 11% from that peak in the S&P on February 19th. You can also see that the factor-weighted portion of the portfolio, it's still down over 20%, but it's much more defensive and it's behaving as we would have expected it to be, not losing as much as the cap-weighted equity part of the portfolio. All right, and we'll move on to slide 10 here. And slide 10 is really intended to demonstrate two main things. First of all, again, the volatility of the markets, but then also the really unprecedented policy response to this pandemic. So the blue line here, the line that starts at the top, that represents the S&P 500, and you can see that from its peak on February 19th, the S&P 500 lost approximately 35% of its value, so over a third of its value, which is a pretty severe drawdown in the equity markets. You can also see the bottom line, or the orange line, the VIX, actually went from low teens to over 80, and the VIX is a volatility index, also known as a fear index, so it represents sort of the forward-looking volatility in the markets. And as I said, you can see it went from the low teens to over 80, so a huge jump in the VIX there. But across the top, you can also see some of the time points. It's kind of a timeline that reflects some of the things that the policy makers did to address the drawdown. First of all, on the monetary side, you can see that the Fed and other central banks acted very quickly, and this is unlike in 2008. The Fed cut interest rates 200 basis points in two surprise rate cuts. They also flooded the markets with liquidity through the purchase of public market instruments. And then finally, they messaged to the market through forward guidance that they would do whatever it takes to make sure that the markets remain liquid and that they remain functioning, the investment markets. Fiscal policy also had a strong response, with multiple bills out of the federal government highlighted by the $2 trillion CARES Act bill. And you've seen similar fiscal responses elsewhere around the globe, in Europe and in Asia. And these responses have helped, but note that the returns are still negative, and it's worth noting that the economic and the earnings data are just starting to reflect some of the impact of the pandemic. So one thing that is certain is that we will have continued volatility. None of us has a crystal ball for how the portfolio will continue to perform. We do continue to execute our plan. That's the key, is having and sticking to the plan. But we are very confident that continued portfolio volatility will remain in place as the earnings data and the economic data start to flow in. So here we talk about the plan on slide 11, and really the key here is that we continue to execute, and that while the market's liquidity has been challenged, the portfolio's liquidity, the liquidity of the PERF, is very strong. As Marcy mentioned, one of Ben's key initiatives when he got here was to bring in a very strong liquidity management framework, and we're finding that the robustness of our liquidity management framework has been very healthy, and I would say that the portfolio is in as strong a liquidity status as it's ever been. We've also been meeting as a team constantly to make sure that we can navigate these markets. We have a couple of meetings early in the morning. The first one is around markets and the market liquidity. That's the group of people in the trade desk and the public markets getting together and talking about how the markets are functioning. And then from there, we move to one of the more senior meetings of the team, which is where we talk about the portfolio and the risk positioning and making sure that we are having the portfolio positioned how we want it to be, of course, subject to market liquidity, but having the portfolio and the risk exposures where we want them. And then finally, late in the day, we do a business continuity meeting where we get together and discuss really how the business model is working. We certainly had a business continuity plan going into this. Again, we probably didn't expect that it would be migrating to a 100% remote work environment, but one of the key things about a business continuity plan is being able to be flexible and handle the challenge, whatever that challenge is, because you can't forecast what it's going to look like, but you can forecast how to have a plan and address it. The last thing I would mention is that in addition to all this work on the public market side, we certainly have the private markets folks spending lots of time digging in. Valuations have gotten more interesting, and the private markets folks are really looking for opportunities to deploy capital where the forward-looking returns are compelling. So again, we're maintaining discipline and sticking to the plan. The key is to make sure that we have sufficient liquidity and to keep panic and emotion out of the decision-making, and that'll allow us to navigate these very challenging markets. So I know we'll have an opportunity for questions later, so from there I'll turn it over to Scott, and we'll be happy to take the questions from there. But for right now, Scott, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. So what we have here on this slide is we have an example of a visual picture of how the investment gains and losses are amortized. As you can see, with that first little dot, that's where we are today. And on June 30th, 3 months from now, that's the end of the fiscal year. The one thing you should note is after the fiscal year ends, we get a return, and then it's a 2-year delay until the first payment would occur that would reflect the amortization on this loss. So for public agencies, your first payment would be in fiscal year 22-23. As you can see by the diagram, the payments are ramped up over a 5-year period, and then they stay level after that for the remaining 15 years. A similar diagram for schools. Schools and state, basically the only difference in how it's the same methodology and how we amortize the payments. There's a 5-year ramp up on the gain and loss for investment returns. Primarily the main difference is for state and schools, the payment occurs a year earlier. There's only a 1-year delay between the valuation date and the first payment. And in this case, the schools and the state would see a change in their payments based on the investment returns in fiscal year 21-22. On slide 14, we have a kind of like a simplified example of what some numbers would look like for a sample return. In this example, we picked a 2% return for the year, and that gives us a 5% investment loss. As you can see, the investment loss, the first payment starts out relatively low. In this case, if you do the math, the payment starts out at around 2.5% of the original balance. And then it grows over the next 4 years to an ultimate rate, in this example, of $62,000, a little over $62,000, and that's paid for the remaining 15 years. One of the reasons that we switched to this amortization period a couple of years ago is it was to enhance benefit security and also improve intergenerational equity. It also reduces the total amount of payments and interest over the side, and we also improve these fund sustainability. And it helps by the sustainability is increased by reducing the probability of dropping below 50% funded status. Question that often comes up is, what's going to happen to the funded status of the plan? Here we have a slide that has a sample miscellaneous plan, the safety plan, the schools pool, and the overall PERF. And across the top, we have 4 different investment returns, 7%, 0, a -5, and a -10. In the first column is the 7%, which is our discount rate and assumed rate of return. And those numbers in that first column are what we would expect plans to be funded at as of 6/30/20. And you can see generally we're in the low 70% to the perf being overall around 72%. Moving to the right, you see what those funded statuses drop to based on a 0, a -5, and a -10%. With the 0 return, we see plans dropping basically around 4.5 to 5%. And then for the -5 and the -10, you can likewise see drops in the funded status. Even though it's a substantial drop in the funded status, you can see that most of the plans still would be over 60%, even with a -10% return. On slide 16, we go ahead and we look at the other common question we get. What are our rates going to be with various investment returns? We have the same 4 investment returns as in the previous slide. The baseline of 7% is the bottom dark blue line, and it goes up to the top line, the light green line of a -10%. For the sample miscellaneous plan here, what we see is the difference between the 7% and the 0% line is around 4% at the max. That difference increases to around a 6.5% difference with a -5%. And when I'm mentioning here a 4% change, that's an absolute number. So if your contribution was 20, it would go to 24. Here are some samples for the safety plan. The shape is similar, but the rates are a lot higher. You can see rates in the worst case peaking up close to 70% in this example. The differences also are greater than the miscellaneous plan. We see a peak difference for a 0% return, resulting in a 6.5% increase over expected rates, and that actually jumps up to over 11.5% with a -5% return. Here's the projection for the schools plan. It's a little bit similar to miscellaneous. The peak difference we see is around 3.5% with a 0% return. That difference increases to around 5.5 with a -5. I think what you can see is in all the last 3 slides that rates would increase over the next 5-6 years, and then they decrease over the next 20 years, dropping down all to the same, basically the normal cost. And as discussed previously, depending on the return for the year, we would probably see a drop in the funded status for all the plans in CalPERS. In general, the lower the funded status of the plan, the more difficult it can be to get to be full funded. Basically, this is because required payments towards the unfunded liability becomes quite large, and it would continue for over 20 years. Slide 19 shows the estimated number of plans that would fall below 60% as of June 30, 2020, under several different investment returns. All things being equal, we would expect these plans to have a somewhat more difficult time being fully funded and getting to be fully funded than other plans. And I'll bring up one last point, that one of the reasons the amortization period was shortened to 20 years was for faster improvement in the funded status. The longer it takes a plan's funded status to recover, the greater the chance there is for negative additional events to occur and to jeopardize the funding of the plan. And with that, I will, that wraps up my section, and I'll pass it along to Michael.
Scott, this is Brad. Before you move on, we've had several questions related to slide 14. If you could go over that one more time about the differences between how the school rates are applied and the public agencies, the timing.
Sure. Sure. So basically, slides 13 and 14, if you look, are fairly identical. There we go. If you look, slide 12 and 13 are identical. The way we amortize is identical. There's a 5-year ramp up and then 15 years of level payments for a 20-year amortization. The primary difference is there's a 2-year delay from the valuation date to when the first payment occurs for the public agencies. There's a 1-year delay for the schools. So, we end this fiscal year June 30, 2020. The gain or loss due to the investment returns this year will be reflected in payments starting in 2021 for the schools, and it will be first reflected in 2022 for public agencies. And that's the only difference between it's basically the if you compare the two pictures, they're identical. The only thing is it's being shifted one fiscal year because the school's payment comes up 1 year earlier.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We can move on to Michael.
Thanks, Scott and Brad. Let me click through to get to this next slide. This slide really, I think, probably captures what you're already seeing at the local level. And so I'm probably not telling you what you already don't know. But just to highlight a couple of the key points that we're seeing as we interact with you at the local level is obviously many of you came into this downturn in very different fiscal situations. Not only your percent funded on your overall pension plan, but also a number of agencies had the opportunities to either build up pre-funding trust funds, which will now be available to help make pension payments, but others built up their rainy day funds that they're able to draw on to make their obligations. So each local agency, we understand, is very situated individually, and that's obviously going to affect as you react to this crisis. Things are moving quickly. In most cases, we understand that you're seeing your revenues drop rather sharply and almost immediately, really in an unprecedented speed, particularly due to your reliance on either sales tax, excise taxes, or really sort of tourism-based tax revenues. All of those things have dried up and will continue to dry up. So while Scott just talked about how this year's poor investment returns won't hit local agencies for 2 more years and schools 1 more year, I'm guessing many of you are concerned about making your base existing payments that you were already planning on while your tax revenue sources have dried up and sort of been pulled out from under you. And so at the same time, you're dealing with what every public agency is dealing with, trying to figure out how to continue to provide your core work, your core services to the public in a remote environment that is causing additional stress to your operations. And finally, the key point here is that really the future is full of uncertainty. key most will be the length of whatever recession we experience, how quick the bounce back will be, but also state finances are up in the air. Federal stimulus is up in the air, whether or not there will be an additional stimulus package and how that may or may not affect pension plans. Certainly, CalPERS will be engaging with the federal government to make sure that public pension plans are considered in their deliberations and that there's any assistance that can be provided to pension participants is provided. So with all of that as background as to your struggles, this next slide really tries to lay the overall framework of which CalPERS is operating under. First and foremost, we need to keep our fund actuarially sound. And the reason for that is all of our active employees and retirees are still earning their benefits. The checks are still going to go out. And so therefore, the contributions still need to happen. From a contribution standpoint, the only way that we're able to invest funds and sort of take advantage as the market does rebound is by getting in your contributions. So to the extent those keep coming in, Dan and Ben in the investment office, along with their teams, can really sort of put their strategies into action to help the fund rebound as quickly as possible. And then I know many of you have questions about making benefit design changes or suspensions of cost of living increases. Those really, as we've been stressing the last couple of years, are in the domain of the legislature and the governor. CalPERS has taken seriously our role as a pension fund administrator, and we're trying to provide the payments in as cost-effective a manner as we can, and we'll continue to do so. But in terms of any sort of design changes or suspensions of cost of living increases, those are outside of CalPERS's control and are really a conversation to be had with the legislature. So then that sort of leads us to the right-hand side of the slide, sort of, okay, what can we do with you? We have really stressed the last few years that we consider you a partner, and to abandon you as you're sort of dealing with the most volatile situation in any recent memory isn't right. So we will do what we can within our abilities, within the restrictions that I just mentioned, to find as many ways to be flexible as possible. As I mentioned, you're all in very different situations, and so any relief is going to come on a case-by-case basis. This is a process we've had in place for a number of years, where we can adjust your payment schedules, keeping your overall pension obligations the same. But if you're having short-term cash flow issues or short-term financing problems to pay your pension obligations, we can take a look at your books, your CAFR, your budget, and make sure that there's a long-term sustainable plan for you to get back on track and secure the benefits that you've promised your workers and your former workers. And so the way to do that is really to contact CalPERS, and we can engage in those conversations to see if we have tools available to help you. And the contact information is on a later slide. But really the bottom line is that any relief has to be on a case-by-case basis. We'll need to have comfort that there is a long-term path to get you back on track, make sure that your retirement plan stays actuarially sound, and hope that we can all get through this as expeditiously as possible. So with that, let me turn it over to Renee Ostrander, who is our lead on reporting and other employment issues.
Thank you, Michael. All right, let me move this slide forward. As Michael mentioned, my name is Renee Ostrander, and I am the Chief of the Employer Account Management Division. And today I'm just going to spend a few minutes speaking about information related to the impact of COVID-19 on your day-to-day operations. So the first piece that I wanted to cover had to do with the governor's executive order N2520. That was released on March 4th of this year. And in that executive order, the governor provided a waiver for retired annuitants. And the waiver was specific for the 960-hour limit and for the 180-day limit. So in the past declarations that he had made, there had already been a waiver of the 60-day requirement that is linked to normal retirement age. There still is not a waiver at the federal level of a predetermined arrangement for work, but the 60-day ip is not in place. So you cannot have predetermined arrangements with anybody that would be retiring, but if an arrangement is made after their retirement, it can be in less than that 60 days due to the governor's declaration of a state of emergency for us. I will mention that all other rules are in place, so you still are required, if you bring back a retired annuitant, to have a resolution for an interim. There can be no additional benefits. We'll talk a little bit about benefits in just a minute based on the federal package, but you cannot have any additional benefits. None of that has been waived through the governor's executive order. So talking a little bit about the federal package, we have received a lot of questions recently related to the two items in the package that are mandating employers make payments. One is the emergency sick leave, and the other one is the FMLA payments. And so we've done a lot of looking into this. The preliminary determination, and we will be sending out a circular letter with all the final information, but our preliminary review in this is that that these can be made to retired annuitants. We will not be seeing it as a violation since it's a mandated federal benefit to pay. It would not be considered a violation. However, all of those hours do need to be counted towards the 960-hour limit. And so if you have someone that is not working on COVID-related duties related to the governor's executive order, then those would still be in place those would still be counted towards the 960 hours. From that, we'll move on to membership. We've received a lot of questions also from our employer community related to the 1,000-hour rule. So some of the work that is potentially needed for part-time members that are working, concerns about working them over 1,000 hours, and is there any relief on the enrollment of those part-time employees at 1,000 hours? And the answer is no. There has been no relief provided in any type of legislative or governor's executive order release for that. So if they do hit 1,000 hours within this fiscal year, regardless of the type of work that they're doing, they would need to be enrolled for CalPERS membership. We've also received some.
I'm sorry, this is Brad. Renee, I just wanted to interrupt you because we had a question, a clarifying question. Did Renee just say we need to do a resolution passed by the City Council to bring back a retiree to waive the 180-day period?
Thanks for the question, Brad. So the resolutions are only required if they're in a particular position that's an interim capacity position. So, for example, if you've needed someone to come back to fill that interim role under Government Code Section 21221H, there's a requirement that resolutions be done to fill those on an interim basis. So for your extra help positions, no, those resolutions are not required for 180 days. But for those individuals that would have required a second resolution to interim fill a specific spot. So for example, a city manager, a CFO, some position that's in that line. Those resolutions would still be required for that, but you would not be required the resolution for the 180 days. Okay.
Great.
So,
thanks. Go ahead.
yeah, thank you, Brad. So the next piece is on reporting data. So I know this is where I've even seen a lot of questions coming in just this morning on this chat related to this. So the question is about reportability of these items that are in the federal packages. So the sick leave, the emergency sick leave, the 80 hours, and then the FMLA paid leave. And so we're currently still looking into this. We will tell you that our preliminary review is that we believe it's all reportable, but we are still trying to finalize that, and that will be coming out in a circular letter to you. We are hoping to have that out early next week at the latest. So as I mentioned, we're trying to finalize that and gather a little bit more information. We have received questions related to unemployment insurance and whether or not that's reportable. Unemployment insurance payments are not reportable, but if it's in connection to a leave that you're doing, a supplemental leave that's related to the federal package, we believe that is going to be reportable. We've also received some questions regarding maybe some changes that might be happening for you with some of your groups, if you're changing payment or you're adding additional payments for them related to MOU review, emergency changes. If you have any questions on that, we would definitely ask for you to send them to our MOU review mailbox. And that mailbox is MOU_review@calpers.ca.gov. We're happy to review those. We will turn those around really quickly for you. We know that you're needing to handle these things quite expeditiously, so we will try to do the same for you. The final piece is related to fee waivers. And we did mention a little bit of that in our circular letter, 200-016-20. So we talked about that in some of the FAQs. So if employers are having difficulty because maybe they've shut their operations down in their office, and so trying to submit payroll is difficult, or maybe the individual that submits your payroll has been out and you don't have somebody that has that information, there is the ability in the system, and it doesn't have to be the payroll individual. It can be anyone that has that system access to request extensions to avoid any type of penalties being assessed. So you can go in and you can request that extension, put in there that issue. If for some reason you do miss that, there is the ability to request fee waivers in the system. In that circular letter, we provide information on how to do that as well if you do see any assessed against you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brad for some contact information and resources.
Thank you, Renee. First, many of you have asked about a copy of the slides, and we will be making that available following the webinar today. We will send out the slide deck as well as a recording of the webinar that you can share with your colleagues if they were not able to participate this morning. On slide 23 here, we have some contact information for various groups within the organization. On the left-hand side is our financial office, where you can contact them regarding our SEPT fund as well as the pension contract management team. In the middle of the slide, of course, we have our employer contact center that you can reach out to with questions, our employer response team, and then at the bottom is our CalPERS stakeholder relations team. If there's a question that you think of after this webinar that you would like addressed, please feel free to reach out to our stakeholder relations team and we'll try to get you an answer. And then finally, we've listed some resources on the right-hand side of the slide that you should think about. We do have some FAQs that we're trying to keep up to date on our website. You can reference them as well as the Public Agency and School Reference Guide and any virtual training that we can do over the next couple months. So at this point, I'd like to get to the questions, and we do have many questions I'm going to start with one around our discount rate. And the question is, due to the coronavirus, will the CalPERS board or will the agency consider changing the discount rate outside its existing ALM process? So Marcy or Scott, if you want to take that.
This is Marcy. I can start, and then we can have Scott add anything. The asset liability management, or ALM, process is actually, we're in that cycle now. And in July at the offsite with the board, we will be taking them through the asset allocation side, the A side, if you will. And then through the fall, we will share the results of the experience study. And then Scott and his team will come forward with recommendations, or their best recommendation for the actuarial assumptions, and one of those actuarial assumptions would be the discount rate. But that would be in November of 2020 this year. But we're not seeing any reason to expedite a decision for the board to change the discount rate before the normal cycle, in particular because the normal cycle actually begins in July of this year.
Yeah,
did you have anything to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I had the same alignment with Marcy. We're basically going to be starting the process this summer, and I don't see the necessity of having to move everything up and rush through it. We do try and take a long-term approach. We don't want to take any 1 year's returns or what's happening and let that affect what we do. So, right now we're on schedule to do the review and the whole process next year, and our goal is to maintain that and look at everything as we normally would do.
Okay, thank you, Marcy and Scott. Our next question: has there been any discussions about establishing a true financial hardship criteria for local agencies? Michael, do you want to take that? Or Michael or Marcy?
Yeah, let's have Michael start.
Yeah. So I think that was a financial hardship is really what I was speaking of earlier on a case-by-case basis. Obviously we want to be able to make sure that an agency truly is in a financial hardship, but then we have done a variety of things in the past with those agencies that are struggling to make their payments to sort of restructure the timing of payments. And again, the key goal of all of this is to get you back on track as quickly as possible. But we do have some flexibility, and we do have a hardship policy, but it's going to be on a case-by-case basis where, there's going to have to be a back and forth between the agency and CalPERS to figure out what's affordable and what's not.
And Michael, just to piggyback on that, another question is, will you let every city know CalPERS case-by-case decision for each employer? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it would be the employer reaching out to us. Is that correct?
Correct. We're not going to proactively be reaching out to you. So the email address that was on the previous slide for our pension contract unit is where you would want to reach out if you are in a hardship situation. And then absolutely there would likely be back and forth over a number of weeks, but you would be kept apprised of where we are in our process. And certainly the outcome of any decisions would be communicated back to the requesting jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I'll move to our next question, and it's about cost of living adjustments. Will future COLAs be frozen for a period of time? And why can't CalPERS management recommend COLA changes be made? I'll let anyone on the team jump in there.
Okay, I can start. This is Marcy. The COLAs are actually part of the benefit design, and CalPERS does not make the decisions. The legislature determines the law along with the governor about what pension benefits are able to be offered, and then, of course, those are negotiated locally in some cases. But the COLA itself would be considered part of the pension design, and it would not be within the role of CalPERS to make a recommendation or to try to implement something that's outside of the current law.
Okay, thank you, Marcy. Dan, this next one is for you, and I know you probably don't have a crystal ball, but many people were asking if we have any estimate of what our returns may look like on June 30th.
Thanks, Brad. And you're correct. We don't have a crystal ball. If we had to guess an estimate, it would probably be the current number, just because we think that in very short 3-month type returns, the mean is something like 0, though with certainly quite a bit of volatility. I will say the markets have been much more volatile. They've been much more buoyant the last week or so, 2 weeks. We do think valuations are lower than they were, so there is potential cause for optimism. We do know there's discussions of more fiscal packages, and market liquidity is improving, but it's really hard to estimate what the market's going to do over the next 3 months. I will say that the key for us is just to navigate it and monitor it vigilantly, and that's certainly what we're doing.
All right, thank you, Dan. And this next question, is CalPERS going to make any administrative changes to fees in arrears or provide more leniency for agencies that might not be able to make payments? Maybe Michael or Marcy want to address that.
Yeah, I can
Michael,
take a Sure. Absolutely. I think Renee spoke to, if you're having difficulties because of your operations, that's obviously a very compelling reason for us to waive any fees or penalties. And also, in the case of financial hardship, again, we would look at that. It doesn't make any sense to penalize you for things outside of your control, or to impose penalties on top of bills you're already struggling to pay. So that is an area where we have some administrative flexibility, and certainly would look to it upon request to try to help you out.
All right, thank you, Michael. Another investment question. How can you say our liquidity is strong when the payout exceeds cash by $5 billion? Dan, you want to take that?
Happy to. I would say that the way that we would say our liquidity is strong is because we know that's the case, and we have that built into our assumptions. So as we manage our liquidity out over, sort of our 7-day, 30-day, 90-day, and then even longer horizons, we're very aware of the cash flow negativity of the plan. We also have income off of not only on the private assets, specifically real assets, but then also income coming off of the fixed income portion of the portfolio. And we're taking all of those incomes and outflows into account when we look at our liquidity profile, and that's where we would say that we are managing that closely, similar to where a person would manage their personal checkbook, even if they have large outflows.
All right, thank you, Dan. And if I can pick on you again, Dan, another investment question. I thought that this year's investment market was very strong, but for this fiscal year only returned 6% due to COVID. I think the general question is with that background, do you believe that our 7% discount rate is truly achievable?
The short answer is yes, I do. If we didn't think it was achievable, we would have, worked to adjust it. We had, a 5.6% return for the first half of the fiscal year, the first 6 months. This, of course, has changed that and has brought the returns down to negative 4% for the first 9 months, fiscal year to date. But we're a very long horizon investor, and over very long horizons, and by long horizons I mean multi-generational horizons, but over long multi-generational horizons, we do believe that 7% is an appropriate discount rate and an appropriate expected rate of return.
All right, thank you, Dan. Scott, I believe this next question falls in your area. Given the disruption of just business operations with the coronavirus, do you foresee any delays in reports available to cities, like the valuation reports?
We're doing our best to get everything out on time. We have the state and schools rates coming out in the April board meeting in a couple weeks, and they're on time. And we are just ramping up our process for the public agency valuations. It is, a bit more challenging having to do 4,000 valuations with everyone at home, but we are working through it. We hope things aren't delayed. It may be delayed somewhat, but I would not say that we anticipate major delays as of right now with getting the reports out. We try to get them out around the August time frame. It may be a little bit later than that, but right now we're doing relatively well on the workload, and if things do shift and we anticipate things coming out later, we'll let everyone know that.
All right, thank you, Scott. We did have several questions regarding investment restrictions. So given the uncertainty in the markets and the volatility, would CalPERS consider changing any of its current restrictions around investments? And I think what we're referring to here are the divestment policies that we have in place. So I'll look to Marcy or Dan to address that.
Okay, thanks, Brad. It's Marcy. The current policies around divestments that are currently in place for the portfolio have a 5-year requirement to come back and review those particular divestment actions. Those are all coming back to the board in 2021, so there will be an opportunity for us to look at it through that fiduciary lens again and determine the board's perspective and action as it relates to the current divestments around tobacco, coal, et cetera. So we don't anticipate changing that again, since the review date is in 2021 for all of the current divestments.
All right, thank you, Marcy. Next question is about our pension outlook tool that we've made available to employers. Scott, so maybe you can address this. What is your recommended advice for setting assumptions?
Could you repeat that question again? I didn't catch all of it. Sorry, Brad.
Sure, no problem. In our pension outlook tool, they're asking if what your recommended advice is.
Since the review date is
for setting assumptions.
Oh, for setting assumptions? Yeah. It goes back to I think the biggest assumption people need to be looking at right now is the year-to-date return. And my suggestion is I would, like the slide show, several scenarios of different numbers. Like Dan mentioned earlier, we don't have a crystal ball of where returns are. They're very volatile right now, and it changes on a daily basis. I would run, if you want, I would suggest running a 0 and a -5, similar to what we showed today, and seeing the impact on your particular plan. The advantage of that tool is you can run your plan today, and then a month from today you can rerun it when we have more current information. So For now, I would just run it at a 0 and -5, and then we'll see where things go and where the market goes, and hopefully that number actually becomes a positive number, and you can then run those numbers as well.
All right, thank you, Scott. This next question is for Renee. Will CalPERS consider relaxing its independent contractor rules due to the coronavirus?
So our current rules related to reviewing an independent contractor versus an employee are set by case law and by statute. And so thus far, none of those have been changed with any of this. We are always available to employers if they have any questions about a contract that they would like to put in place. If there's a need to have it expedited for review and provide feedback, we're also happy to do that.
All right, thank you, Renee. And Scott, I apologize, I meant to ask you this follow-up question, and that is the pension outlook tool for pooled plans still on track?
Yes. We're in the process of trying to get both the public access of pension outlook and the pooled plan aspect up as well. We're in the process of reviewing which one we can do sooner and which one we can get out. We're still looking right now towards the end of June timeframe for at least one of those releases. We were having discussions with our IT staff this morning about timing and whether we can get that moved up, and I just don't have that information right now. Hopefully, when we get a better idea on when we can get it out, we could send out an update to everyone.
All right, thank you, Scott. We'll move on to our next question. I understand CalPERS' position on being a benefits administrator and leaving plan design changes to the legislature. However, will you consider putting together reports for the legislature and unions on how damaged the funding status is? And some of the only ways to shore it up might be through the suspension of COLAs or plan changes. Seems nothing can happen at the Capitol if there isn't fact-based options coming out of CalPERS that show the severity of the problem. Marcy, do you want to jump in there?
Yes, I'm happy to address that. Even though CalPERS, as far as the pension policy or the benefit design, we've been pretty clear about where our role is. Part of that role also is what I would call pricing out certain types of proposals that would come in as a result of a legislative inquiry, an employer inquiry, a bargaining table inquiry, that we can give you some fiscal impact information or fiscal impact statements on, ideas or proposals that are happening through, those three channels. So it's not that we won't be helpful in any way. It's just how we can be helpful is really getting data to inform the decision-making process versus being the decision makers. And we have our actuaries who will be able to provide those reports. We do provide reports to the legislature regarding the healthy or the funded status or the health status of the pension plan. We can, generate those reports and make them more publicly available if there is a desire to do so. But Scott and his team also do the risk report. They do that every year. It gets presented to the board. It's, we can make that more available if people are having a hard time finding it. But I do think we've been transparent around the funded status. I certainly report that out of my CEO report on a regular basis. We've been very clear about the investment risks that we're taking on in the portfolio. I think we've been really clear about what we see and hear from, the 3,000 public employers who are participating in one of the plans, that the affordability of the plans and making these contributions has become even more difficult as we've made decisions that are really intended to make the fund sustainable for the long run. And we're happy to be as transparent as possible and where we see those risks. And if there's a request from another policymaker or a decision maker to have more specific data, we're obviously happy to be able to provide that.
Thank you, Marcy. Renee, I think I heard you say this, but I am getting several questions about the emergency family medical leaves and the sick leave and whether those are reportable. I believe you said that our initial review is yes. If that's the case, will we be notifying employers?
Yes, yeah, you did hear that right. Our preliminary review on that is that both of those items are reportable. And we will have a circular letter going out. We're hoping the latest it will be out would be early next week. We know all of our employers need to be keying this into their systems for when they pay it to be able to pull those contributions. Some of the other questions I think that are tied to that as well have to do with whether or not it counts towards the 1,000 hours for a membership requirement. And the answer is yes. It should be, those hours should count towards the 1,000 hours when you're trying to determine whether or not to bring someone into membership.
All right, thank you, Renee. Bear with me. We've gotten several questions. I'm just trying to scroll through some of these. We did have a question, Michael, about whether all of what we're talking about today applies to our CERT program. Is there anything that employers should be aware of with changes around that?
No, the program is still operational. Obviously, the investment returns are going to be somewhat similar to our overall per fund returns, but the allocation is slightly different. We can certainly get end of quarter information on the returns out there, but when people sign up, they do have the option of picking a couple of different strategies. So in terms of our pre-funding for either retiree health and pensions, they're both still available. And as local agencies are sort of, obviously dealing with their struggles, but if they end up with some extra money unanticipated at the end of the year, those might be good places to invest the funds. So the programs are still fully operational, and funds are available to help you make withdrawals as needed under the current rule requirements.
All right, thank you, Michael. And just to follow up on the suspension of COLAs, Scott, maybe you can address this, and I believe this has been provided to our board, but what impact would suspending the COLAs have on the fund?
It depends how you suspend the COLA. Let's just say you take an example where for some you were able to not pay additional COLAs. There's a difference between are you going to cut all COLAs and reduce people's pensions, or are you just not going to pay the additional COLA that occurs during the year? If you go with the route that you're just not going to pay the additional COLA, there's not going to be a substantial impact on rates or funded stats. When you think about it, it's not like if you don't pay out the COLAs, employer contributions are reduced on a one-to-one basis. That non-payment would be reflected as a gain. So when you think about it, let's say the COLAs weren't paid in 2021, we would see that as a gain when we were looking at the 21 valuation. That gets rolled into as a gain that would first show up in the 23-24 valuation, and that would also be amortized over 20 years, following the same process. Just as just as the losses are amortized over 20 years, gains are amortized over 20 years. That'd be a gain, and that'd be amortized over 20 years consistent with our amortization policy. So suspending COLAs is not going to give this substantial reduction in contributions or relief to cities or employers.
All right, thank you, Scott. I know we're about 10 minutes away from our ending time, so I did want to give our board members that are participating in this webinar today an opportunity to speak and make any comments or address any questions that may have come up. So if I could, I'll turn to our board president, Henry Jones. Henry?
Am I off on mute now? Can you hear me?
You are, Henry. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for a very informative presentation and dialogue with our partners and agencies. But first of all, I would just like to, on behalf of the board, administration, to thank Marcy and the executive team and all of CalPERS members for all of the outstanding work and dedication in protecting our employees and serving our members and employers and our stakeholders as CalPERS continues to deal with the COVID-19. And the work has been exemplary, and the protocols that you swiftly implemented for safety and sanitation involving the practice of social distancing while continuing to serve our members have been exemplary. And, we're in an area that it's really uncharted territory that we have seen in this new, in this country related to this new COVID-19. And it's truly a black swan, and my definition of a black swan is that it's impossible and difficult to predict. And this is certainly one that we are facing now. But just the evidence of the dialogue today is that we all need to continue to protect the system. And when I say system, I'm talking about CalPERS and the 3,000 members of the CalPERS family, the agency. So we need to continue to work together, and we don't know at this time how deep or how long this will last. It depends on a number of factors that are out of all of our control. So we just have to continue to monitor the marketplace, continue to market the policy decisions that are being made at the federal and state level, and continue to come back and have this kind of dialogue with the agencies, because many times your questions generate action. So we appreciate your time and effort and sharing with us your concerns so that we can make sure that we take those and then incorporate them as we go forward. And just one last point on the asset liability management, as I think Marcy mentioned, the objective of that is a long-term horizon. And so that process is looking out 40, 50, 60 years from now. And so, but that doesn't remove the aspect that we have investment policies that deal with the short-term situations, such as our asset allocation when they vary from the targeted allocation by more than a certain percentage point, then the board does get involved. When the liquidity issues surface, the board does get involved. So we do have policies to get involved in the short term and the day-to-day and the month-to-month. But the asset liability process is to determine what that return will be over a longer period of time. So thank you for the opportunity to listen to all of your comments today. And with that, I will turn it back to Brad.
Thank you, Henry. Now I'll turn the floor over to our Vice President, Teresa Taylor. Teresa?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Teresa, go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank all the employers for joining us today. And I know this is a scary time, and I hope everybody's taking care of themselves and their families, and I wish everybody the best during this crisis, this health crisis, because that's what this is, first and foremost. I also want to thank Marcy and our team. Marcy's been keeping the board very well informed. Our team is working diligently to continue paying our benefit payments and making sure that the fund is working and funded. And I just want to thank our investment team and our actuaries and everybody that's been working so diligently to help us understand everything that's going on right now, given the unusual status that we're dealing with. And I just want to, I heard a lot of talk about and questions about, what our funded status is and what that means going forward. But I know, I work at a taxing agency. I know that this business disruption, what it does to state revenues, because that's where I work, is Franchise Tax Board, and I know what it's doing to the county, cities, and municipalities' revenues, and I know that's scary right now. And I want to encourage you all to work with our actuarial office and our other CalPERS team members to access the tools available that a lot of you had questions about, and I'm sure as we move forward in this, there's going to be lots of work being done between everybody to make sure that payments can be made, that hardships can be accessed, so that we can help you mitigate some of these disruptions. But I just want to also say that we are a long-term investor, and let's make sure that we don't overreact. I get that we're all in an uncharted territory, but I think our team has shown that it's well prepared to weather this downturn. And one of the things that I think about is retirement security. And we have access to a defined benefit pension plan that many Americans don't. And it helps the state of California in terms of how much money gets spent by retirees in the state of California. It helps our cities and counties with their revenues as well. And I just want to make sure that we continue to pay benefits, we continue to be funded, we continue to work together to guarantee to our members the ability to retire in dignity. And again, I just want to thank all of you for working with us. I'm glad we did this presentation, and I continue to encourage you to work with our team members and Marcy. And again, hopefully everybody's taking care and everyone's well. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. And finally, our board member that represents local governments is joining us, and that's Lisa Middleton. So I'll turn the floor over to Lisa.
Thank you, Brad. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this call today. I think it has been very helpful. I do represent local government on the board. I'm a member of the City Council in Palm Springs, California. I know very personally what it's like to manage a budget in times such as this. And the fear that all of us have of being able to deliver on the services that we know that we are responsible for is very tangible. I would like to offer to engage with all of you in further conversation. So I'm going to give you my email address, and it's a pretty easy one, lisa.middleton, MIDDLETON, @palmspringsca.gov. And I am happy to engage further in conversation as we move forward. We're going to have to be very careful to define accurately what the additional costs are that we are seeing coming to us. I want to thank Marcy and her team for offering to do fiscal impact reports. I think it is important as we talk about what we think should be done to make sure that the programs are sustainable for the long term, that we are identifying things that truly will make a difference and identifying them accurately. And there will be a lot of work before us, but I'm going to close with one of the reminders that each and every one of us would get if we were to call our financial advisor today and ask what we should do, and they would look at us and say, take the long view, remember that we are investing for the future, and that is particularly true here. We have multiple generations in CalPERS that we're responsible for, those that have retired, those who are approaching retirement, and in many cases, those that have just started working, that this system needs to be there for them in 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you also, Henry and Teresa. We are at 11:30. We certainly want to be respectful of your time. I know that everyone is very busy right now. Before I turn to Marcy to close us out, I just wanted to remind you that we will send the slide deck and a recording of the webinar to you after the fact. I know that there are many more questions that we weren't able to get to. We will answer those, we'll collect them, and make sure that we get them out to all participants. So with that, I'll turn to Marcy to close us out.
Thank you, Brad. As Brad indicated, we'll get you off of here, so we know that you have a lot of work going on in your own respective organizations. So what we do commit to you is that we will continue ongoing communication. We know that that is very important, even at the strategy level, down to the tactical level. We will remain available to you for phone calls. We are a resource to you. As Renee indicated, as you're looking at potential hiring or you're looking at your workforce planning and you have questions as it relates to pensions or to PERS, please reach out to us. Our teams are working very productively from their remote locations, and so we can expedite our answers to your questions. So please use this as a resource ongoing. We do see this as a partnership. The system cannot be sustainable without our participating employers, and we want you all to know that we understand and empathize with what you're having to face right now, the tough budget decisions you're making. We're also doing that at CalPERS. We're making very difficult budget decisions. Our budget will go to the board this month, and I'll give more context about how we're thinking about our budget over the next 90 days, 180 days, and into the next year. And just remember that we are here for you. I hope that you are all safe and healthy and well. And with that, I hope you have a great day, and I'll turn it back over to the team.
All right, that does conclude today's presentation. We do thank you for joining us. We want to thank our presentation team today, and of course you, the audience, for your questions and your comments. Thank you again for joining us. You may disconnect and have a great remainder of your day.